Welcome to Talaterra, a podcast about freelance educators working in natural resource fields and environmental education. Who are these educators? What do they do? Join me, and let's find out together. This is your host, Tania Marien. Today my guest is Laurent. Anna is an award-winning photographer, author, and teacher. Through her projects, Anna introduces new audiences to the wonders of the botanical world. Anna has worked as a columnist for Garden Design magazine and print magazine. Her first book, published in 2016, examines the art and science of plant biology in 19th century wall charts. Anna's interest in plants began in college. Years later, her interest prompted her to quit her job and to find a way to get paid to learn about plants. Did she succeed? Let's find out. It's so nice to finally meet you, to speak with you in person, face to face, because we've spoken a lot here and there over the years. And when we first met online, you were a columnist. You were writing for Garden Design magazine, and you were also writing the botany blueprint article for print magazine at the time. And you were also working on the seed pod project. You were at the time living in Los Angeles, and you were, I believe, this was 2012, right?
I think I was in Portland, Oregon at that point. Yeah, but it's fair that it's accurate that you recall me in Los Angeles, because that's the city I speak about, the landscape I speak about more than any other place as the foundation of my interest in plants, and where all of that started, all the writing that you mentioned. Yeah, so the seed pod project is now called Dispersal. So I'm still working on that. 12 years in, and that was the column for print magazine, which is where my work with plants started. So I was in Los Angeles working as a documentary producer, and I had moved there from Boston, Massachusetts, which has a very different botanic landscape than Southern California. And after about a year in LA, I just sort of became so fascinated with the botanic diversity that is just everywhere in Los Angeles. People think of it as a neon city or a concrete city, but it's a really rare area in that it has so many different ecosystems in one urban area, from the desert to the canyons to the coast. And Los Angeles also has a history of importing a lot of exotic species for the sort of the beautification project of LA that wouldn't happen now because of being mindful of native species. But so Los Angeles is a fascinating area for its botanic diversity. It had imported many species from Asia and Australia, and I encountered plants in an entirely new way there. I felt like they were something that had to be sort of reckoned with, or they weren't as clearly cultivated as they seem to be in New England. There were, trees roots would tear up the sidewalks, and there was just such a sort of a stage of relationships between plants playing out in front of my little studio in West Hollywood. I remember there was a ficus, a fig tree, and a wisteria vine, which are both notably like very robust plants, and they were just sort of fighting it out. And I just saw these interactions in nature that I had never really been aware of. I knew a lot of stuff that I knew about in theory, but seeing it in practice, seeing it right in front of me was just so compelling that I quit my job and decided that what did I say? I said I was going to find a way to get someone to pay me to learn about plants, because at that point I didn't know, I knew very little. So up until, this was in my early 30s, actually, at that point I had an interest in a curiosity and appreciation for relationships and dialogues in nature that I had kept sort of tucked away because I didn't know how to manifest it. I wasn't going to be a scientist. This started when I was an undergraduate at Harvard University. One of my freshman fall courses was I was just sort of casting out to try new things, and I took my background had been in writing and and art, but I was intrigued by a course about interactions between species, particularly it was a course that everybody called sex, which was about how mating patterns, mating behaviors, mating communication between non-human species. And largely the class focused on animals and insects, but there was a brief module on plants. And I remember watching a film called Sexual Encounters of the Floral Kind. And it just blew my mind. But then I didn't know what to do with that. It seemed like I had either had to go pursue a science path, and which I approached and I began, but I don't have a scientific mind, so I didn't know what to do with that. So I just sort of tucked it away. But it would sort of be peaked. So what I loved about the course was the idea that there are dialogues between organisms and species that we're not aware of. That, and then that those are manifested often in visual appearances. The idea that there's that features of a flower or an insect or pretty much any organism you can think of, it looks that way for a reason. There's a function behind the physical attributes: color, texture, shape. And that gave me a real appreciation and began sort of me thinking about the idea of looking at, a plant from the plant's perspective, rather than the human perspective. So there's that sort of early formative sort of awakening. And then years after that, I picked up Michael Pollan's book, The Botany of Desire. And the introduction has a quote I'll never forget, which was the existential dilemma of plants is their immobility. They lack the mobility to pursue a mate, to flee from predators, to protect their young. And so how do they compensate for that immobility? I just thought that was fascinating, and gave me a lot of, an appreciation and admiration for how plants have evolved to make it in this world where everything can move. And so how have plants managed to do all those things, to defend themselves, to reproduce, to nurture their offspring? And that's what wound up emerging in Los Angeles, many years later, in my seed pod project. My first task in LA was to figure out, what to do with this interest. I had some skills. I had writing and photography and filmmaking and, an artistic background. But I didn't know. I needed to find out exactly what it was about plants that I was so driven to learn about and appreciate by creating media around this to share with people, to share my excitement with people. And it after maybe months of hiking around different areas of LA, I began picking up seeds and seed pods. And in LA, there are a lot of the Asian and Australian species have just these sculptural wonders that I had been walking over on the sidewalk for years and had never picked up and had never noticed. And once I started noticing them, I just started furiously collecting them. I put them in Tupperware from the 99-cent store and began, eventually they replaced all the dishes in my kitchen. I guess I'm a collector. And I would, I would pick up, and my sort of interest in educating came along around that time too, on all these walks, because I was just so jubilant when I would find a new specimen of a species that I hadn't seen before. And I would just, grab passersby and say, do you know what this is? Have you seen this before? Like, touch it. Does it look sharp? Does it look soft? Like, look inside. I mean, look at those little seeds. And people had been just as blind to this aspect of plants as I had. So that project, so I began photographing the specimens and researching the form and function, the various ways that species have evolved to fulfill these common functions of nurturing their seeds and protecting them until they're mature, and then dispersing them in dispersing them in a way that's suited to the native environment. So by looking at a seed pod, a seed vessel, by looking at a seed pod, you can sort of begin to infer the series of dialogues that it's had with organisms it's co-evolved with, dispersal agents, and the climate where it has evolved. So that has been one of the foundations of my work.
It is clearly, for my impression, from where I sit, it is the foundation for everything that came after and that you've done. Now, so what I love about this project is I get to find out people's backstories, because I meet them, our lives cross and in different stages. And so I've only known you as a freelancer, as a freelance photographer. That's how I've known your work. And so becoming a freelancer was a conscious choice for you. It was something you wanted to do, right?
It was something I wanted to do. Becoming a freelancer was something I felt I had to do, because this interest in plants wasn't something I was going to ignore, and I didn't know of any other way to figure out exactly what it was about plants that captivated me. Mm-hmm. Because it's really been a journey that I've had to sort of take on, alone.
Yeah. So I loved your intention that you were going to find a way for somebody to pay you to work with plants and to study plants,
to learn about plants.
And to learn about plants. That is really fantastic. That is determination. How did you begin to become paid for the way that you educate people about plants? I mean, how you were already writing for Garden Design magazine. How did
I hadn't been. No. I'd been writing for print magazine. So the column at the time I called it Botany Blueprint. Mm-hmm. This was the series of a photographic portrait of seeds in a seed pod. Each companion article was a combination naturalist's journal entry that tried to kind of capture finding the plant, finding the specimen, because I think it is very important to have a sense of ecology and not to look at plants as isolated from their environment. And I also wanted to take the reader along with me to share this moment of discovery, because that's what I've really tried to do. Another thing I've tried to do in my work is convey my excitement, and when I'm just awestruck at something that I learn about plants, and convey that to my audience. It was very important to me that there was a scientific foundation that explained the adaptations and some fundamental sort of terminology about plants and how they disperse and how they reproduce. One of the challenges was forging this new genre of writing that I was learning as I went along, and trying to make both engaging for a general audience, but kind of slip in some science. Mm-hmm. So I had this collection of photographs and text, and I approached a magazine I had written for previously, a print magazine. I had written about typefaces, and I proposed doing a new column for them about the form and function, the architecture of fruits and seeds. And they said that sounds great. So that gave me some deadlines, which were important, and some accountability. and I started establishing myself as someone who does this sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, some advice to someone pursuing something new would be to use contacts you already have and reconfigure them to support, what you're doing. Sometimes that's easier than forging new contacts. After maybe a year, I was approached by Garden Design magazine for permission to use my images in a slideshow that the web editor was interested in running online. And I said, okay, but actually I have a better idea. How about you give me 2 columns, 2 weekly columns? So I proposed 2 columns to Garden Design magazine, seeing this as an opportunity for me to learn more, for me to, So the columns were wonderful. I was able to choose a couple topics every week that I was interested in, and then write about them.
That's a wonderful progression. When we first spoke, when I interviewed you back in July of 2012, it's been a long time, you were talking about possibly creating a book, The Form and Function of Seed Pods. How you were entertaining that idea. And in the meantime, you had also started partnering with botanic gardens and with arboretums across the country, like the Harvard's Arnold Arboretum and Lotus Land in Santa Barbara, and the Hawaii Tropical Botanic Garden, and other gardens. And your goal then was to tell the stories of 100 seed pods. Have you told the story of 100 seed pods, or have you done a lot more by now?
Yeah, I think I've done a lot more by now. Yeah. It's interesting that you remind me of that. I think that's not something that it's not a project. It's not like a project goal that I've kept in mind. Mm-hmm. To let my career evolve. Mm-hmm. I think in the meantime, other projects came up. Yeah, other projects came up.
Yeah. And so one of them is the Iraqi Seed Project. Yes. And how did that merge into your new career as a storyteller?
It was absolutely serendipitous. A close friend of mine who had been working on this project, the Iraqi Seed Project, for a few years, invited me to join her on a filming trip to Kurdistan. And so the project, I can't take credit for the project's producing. She's an excellent producer. The Iraqi Seed Project was a really interesting juncture in my career that expanded my perception of plants. Previous to that, I had been looking at more, as I said, plants from the plant's perspective, looking at the biological adaptations of plants and form and function. But the Iraqi Seed Project is a documentary project that a friend had been working on for some time about plants and agriculture in the modern day Fertile Crescent. So the area where agriculture began, and the struggle now to preserve biodiversity, especially in a landscape where people had evolved with plants. So we traveled to Kurdistan, and that began my sort of a shift in my work towards protecting biodiversity and looking at a history of seed saving and cultivation.
You're clearly a focus through your work is plant conservation, and you've continued, to document seeds and fruits and seed pods, and I've seen that develop, over time. And you had something very exciting happen this summer. You were invited to participate in an exhibition. And so I'm not going to give it away. It's your story. You tell it, because it's wonderful. It's a wonderful story.
Well, I was one of a few artists invited to go to Svalbard, Norway, which is the world's northernmost permanently inhabited area, and also home to Svalbard Seed Vault. And I presented photographs from the Iraqi Seed Project there. And it was quite an honor. I'd known about the Svalbard seed vault for many years, but possibly like most people, I hadn't realized how critical a seed bank is to preserving future biodiversity and just feeding the world. And I hadn't appreciated the history of seed saving and how cultures value their seeds dearly. Many seed banks around the world, either because of environmental or political conflict, have been destroyed. And the Svalbard Seed Vault is called the Noah's Ark of seeds. And it's especially important today because with climate change, we're not sure what conditions plants will need to adapt to, and they're not going to do it that quick enough. So if we have these seeds, that's a resource that we can use to breed varieties that will adapt to climate change. Mm-hmm. So the whole experience was absolutely wonderful, and that it was really gratifying to show photographs from the Iraqi Seed Project, which includes a photograph of the first known site of where seeds were saved in Jarmo in northern Iraq. And we also had a photograph of a woman a seed scientist, an Iraqi seed scientist, who had saved seeds in her basement during the 2003 looting of the seed bank in Abu Ghraib. Mm-hmm. And so just to sort of, and I think many people had heard about Abu Ghraib, but not because of the seed bank. And having a story like this in the Iraqi Seed Project brought this story to the public.
Mm-hmm. And so you were able to visit the seed bank, correct? And
sadly we weren't able to visit the seed bank. No one is allowed in the seed bank. Yeah. One of the challenges in getting countries to agree to send their seeds to the vault is gaining their trust so they don't think that anything will happen to their seeds or anyone else will take them. So that's one of the policies. The no visitor policy is understandable and
absolutely understandable.
We did get close. Let me back up and explain the purpose of the exhibition. I'm not sure what word to call it. It was more than an exhibition. It wasn't a conference, but it was 4 days where artists presented works that reflected the relationship between cultural and biological diversity. The woman that organized the program noticed a lack of cultural reference in the seed vault itself, which is understandable. And she thought that it was important to recognize that seeds don't only feed us, they also preserve our culture. And the idea was to honor this cultural representation as equally significant as the seeds. And although we weren't able to inter them in the vault itself, we did inter them in a little further up the mountain in a former coal mine, which was also the first site of the seed bank. In the 80s, the Norwegian government created a vault for Nordic seeds, and so it was the first location of the seed vault. So we did go in there with our in the coal mine with our
with your hard hat and
we went in the coal mine with our hard hats and flashlights. Yeah.
Oh wow. Mm-hmm. What an experience, and what a contribution that you and your colleagues have made to the future of biodiversity. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about your book. You are also an author. Of course, not only an author of magazine articles, but you are a book author. And you have this wonderful book, which I have here. Wait, I got to move. I don't know why I didn't pull this first. This lovely book, Botanical Art from the Golden Age of Scientific Discovery. It's about wall charts. Tell us about this project, because it is extensive. So how did that come about, and how did you do the research for this book?
So the book probably began with my garden design column, Art and Botany, where I wrote about the history of visual representations of plants. And then I was approached by a publisher to do the book. And when the project began, we just imagined a book of beautiful reproductions of these wall charts from the late 19th and early 20th century that were produced mostly in Germany, but in Europe as educational classroom large format boards. And plants were a topic that were especially illustrated at the time. As I started researching, I realized there was so much more than just pretty pictures. One of the things I was struck by when I began researching the book and compiling images was the myriad ways that plants can be represented visually, the same species or the same genus. And when I looked at the context in which each chart was produced, I realized that the way that a plant's visually represented reflects something about the scientist behind the illustration or the intended audience. So the process of writing the book took me about 5 years through archives in Europe and the United States. So my early research established that there were certain collections of charts that I sort of saw everywhere. But then when I dug a bit deeper, I realized that there was this all these collections, all these archives, dusty archives that had just been, sort of shelved away because they were teaching tools. And once they became outmoded, they were either discarded or just abandoned. And I really wanted to, I felt like I needed to get a sense of all the ways that plants were represented to begin to sort of understand why. So that led me, very stubbornly through archives in Prague and Berlin.
That's a lot of travel. And so you just wrote them letters, emails, and say, I understand you have this in your collection. Can I document it?
Yeah. Or I just wrote letters. So one of the frustrating things researching it was that you assume these days that anything that's worth knowing is on the internet. But fascinatingly, wall charts are not one of those things. There are so many archives that aren't reproduced online because there hasn't been, a lot of collections just don't bother digitizing them because, they haven't reached the status of fine art yet.
Mm-hmm.
So I would just have to. I just cold called a lot of archives and herbarians to say, hey, do you have anything in your attic archive? I went to Berlin with no archives in mind, but knowing that there had to be a lot there because Germany was a center of wall chart production, and so finally I called the Botanic Garden and asked the librarian if he had any charts, and he said, well, maybe, I don't know, we might have a couple. So I went in and he apologized that they did in fact have quite a trove of wall charts that they had acquired years ago from the neighboring College of Pharmacy, but theirs had been destroyed during the war. Anyway, he said they had a substantial collection, but he apologized that they hadn't been archived. No one had really touched them in maybe 50 years.
Wow.
And I don't know, maybe, check back like when we have a grant to
catalog them.
to catalog them. And it turned out he was just worried I wouldn't want to get dusty. and I said, oh no, that's fine. Just so I spent 3 days in this attic archive of these amazing documents that some of which I was familiar with and I'd only seen online, and it was full of like moments of awe and discovery, much like collecting, finding new seed pod specimens, because the scrolls, they were all rolled up and there was no indication on the outside of the scroll what the chart was. And so I would sort of unroll it and say, oh my God, look at this, like it exists, like this is, like I'm holding it. This is, and the power of seeing, of really holding an artifact versus seeing it online. And it was, but again, like, I think that wall charts are such important cultural, scientific, artistic artifacts, but they're so neglected. This collection was, hadn't been opened in, as he was right, hadn't been opened in 50 years.
Wow. And so of all the charts that you saw, how many were in good condition and how many were torn or brittle or?
Yeah, most were torn or brittle. Yeah, most have been damaged. Most of the ones that I visited myself, a lot of the ones that had been preserved were already online, but it wasn't like I was discovering any preserved, perfectly preserved charts. Mm-hmm. Because even when they were used, they were teaching tools, so they were kind of tossed around. And I even at the Jardin des Plantes in Paris, I asked the librarian there. I visited in person and asked if they had any wall charts, and she said, "Well, I think we do, but I'm a little embarrassed. Come with me." And they were in this like round sort of bin under a stairwell by a heater, by a boiler.
Oh, yeah.
And she said, we know they're valuable, but we don't know what to do with them. So there's a lot. My point is, I guess there's a lot more to learn about the wall charts. They have a lot more to teach us. Writing the book gave my work a guiding inquiry, which became looking at the visual representations of plants and what that says about the people who produced them and their relationship or their perception of plants. So if you look at a history of botanic illustration, it really is a history of our perception and value of plants. If you start with early herbal books, where plants were valued as sources of medicine, to Florilegium, which was lavishly illustrated collections of a private garden, usually, where plants were regarded as something to cultivate and own and something of beauty, to the Flora, which is the age of plant exploration, when plants were regarded as something of empire and exoticism. And then there's not really a fourth story, there's not a fourth chapter to that story that I know of. And looking at the history of botanic illustration and how plants are represented and how they're perceived and valued prompts me to realize that there doesn't seem to be a collective value of plants currently. Historically, plants have been valued, for collection purposes, for empire, for medicine, for as a coded language during the Victorian period. But right now, there doesn't seem to be a reason that plants are important to us. And I don't know how to fix that. But I do know that, that that's a problem. And that's what one of the things my work tries to do is to help people find meaning in plants, mm-hmm. Because it's absolutely critical today that we do.
Yes, absolutely. Plant blindness is a big problem. It's everybody's problem.
Right. And people, I think, maybe often think of a loss of biodiversity as maybe the extinction of a rare Himalayan orchid, but it's so much more than that. Loss of biodiversity isn't a luxury we can afford. It's, my experience in Svalbard reminded me that a loss of biodiversity is, a loss of food for the planet. So.
Yes. Yeah, no, absolutely. So through your work, you have taught people about plants. You have contributed notably to plant conservation and to the story about the history of agriculture through your work. You've documented the history of botany through your book. You've done so much throughout your career. What is next for you?
I have a couple projects in mind. I would love to get back to a book of my dispersal photographs, which I guess I'm about 10 years overdue right now. Whatever my next projects are, they will be focused on raising awareness of species extinction and the importance of biodiversity. So, and I'm not sure what direction that will take. If it will be more, I'm actually sort of at a juncture right now. I've been thinking about this question a lot. If my next major project is a continuation of dispersal, which I put aside while I wrote the book, it's important that it's something that's that addresses climate change and changing ecosystems. So that could be focusing on maybe serotinous species. So serotinous species are plants that only disperse their seeds in the case of fire and extreme heat. And that is something that that we're seeing a lot of with climate change these days. So maybe doing something in Australia, or photographing fruits and seeds of rare and endangered species. As I think about it and plan it in sort of a strategy for the next few years, I'm working on collages. I mean, my whole apartment is covered in collage bits right now, which is another media that I've sort of grabbed onto after a recent project. Last year, in conjunction with an exhibition of my dispersal photographs, a sort of arts hotel in South Kensington, London, which serves as it's a rotating art space, and each of the 4 guest corridors are also muraled by a different artist. And so I was offered one of these corridor spaces, about 20 feet long, and at the time I was very interested in the period, the 19th century, when we had this, there was this perception that plants were, exotic and abundant and were fetishized in, really lush imagery, and thinking about, where we are today, and that we need to reevaluate our relationship with plants and our perception and value of them. And so I created a collage corridor, an installation of collage pieces. The project was called Flora Exploration to Extinction, and I glued them in as a landscape of abundant floral beauty, interrupted by black silhouettes of extinct and endangered species, and then put a sort of a gold Victorian frame around them, to kind of really give the visitor this immersive experience of traveling a landscape and then be struck by the absence of a species, and meanwhile producing it in the sort of the visual language of the Victorian period. And since then, I've been interested in the potential of collage work to juxtapose common elements and kind of prompt the viewer.
Yeah, no, it tells a very striking story to see, just from the images that I've seen you've provided on your website. All this color, this hallway full of color, and then there is a void. It's a very effective story. It really is.
Thank you. I'd love to do that installation again, possibly on a larger scale, in a more public location, because I do feel that it wasn't a powerful and effective way to convey the message.
Yeah, that would be very effective public art, huge mural type scale. I recently read a paper about researchers who were helping the Carnegie Natural History Museum in Pittsburgh describe what a 21st century naturalist is. And one of the descriptions, one of the attributes of a 21st century naturalist is someone who embraces the urban environment as the natural world. And you do that, you definitely do that through your work.
I like that very much. Mm-hmm. That really was what my experience was like, finding nature in the city.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You have elegant photographs of seed pods, and you tell that story. It's just gorgeous. And your way of telling the story about seeds and all that is much more elegant than the way I do it in a fruit lab. My take home point is there are ovaries in your fruit bowl. But it's a beautiful way of storytelling, the way that you do it. Also, just if we can readdress very quickly the funding. How do you start your projects? I mean, you're so good at starting projects and seeing, having a vision and seeing a story to tell. How do you, like your flora example, for example, how do you find a location? Who do you go to and say, I have a story? And then how do you create it? And then how do you say, here, I made this?
That's absolutely something I need to work on is the funding aspect. A lot of my prominent projects, the book, and some of these projects I've gotten just from promoting myself, from being sort of like they've landed they come in the window, the corridor and the book. Dispersal projects, I've approached botanic gardens and arboreta and worked with them, but funding is something I really struggle with. But people that, for freelancers, it's not just about doing good work. It's about self-promotion and finding funding, and a lot of these things that come with come with the territory. And I found funding through organizations and my collaborators. Yeah. Thus far, I've found funding through my collaborators. I would like in my forthcoming work to really take the initiative and find funding. There's a lot of organizations that would love to find artists to fund, and it's we just need to ask. I don't have a great answer for that. I mean, that is, and my goal for the next month is to focus on large grants. But so finding funding, it helps. I mean, if your work can be commodified, I mean, I sell my dispersal prints, so that funds a lot of my work.
Yeah, of course. And then you have your book, and do you do presentations and author events?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I've done a handful of book lectures and artist talks. I mean, some notable ones were at my exhibition at University of California Botanical Garden at Berkeley, which was a collection site of mine for about 3 years. I had the garden hosted an exhibition, and I had a series of events. And so at the opening, so one of the great things about this work is the people. It's the people you meet at the opening exhibition of my show at Berkeley. I was approached by a professor of architecture at Berkeley, who had recently assigned his architecture students my images to choose a dispersal photo and use that as a starting point for a model for sustainable housing. So this idea, he loved this idea of using a seed pod as shelter. And so that was quite an honor. And then I went to do did a presentation at his architecture class with his students, and saw the different ways that they had taken my specimen photograph as a starting point, and then iterated it, had it evolve so it becomes this sustainable housing structure.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's exciting, Anna. Very exciting. So your work is also influencing planning and urban design, biophilic cities. Oh, that's exciting. Exciting.
Yeah. I don't know if you're going to, see an apartment building shaped like a magnolia pod anytime soon, but yeah. But it's an honor when my work is valued, especially by people that aren't looking for the plant connection. Mm-hmm. I think there's such and that's why plants are so fascinating to us, because they do have such an application in different disciplines. They're the structures, they've evolved structures of strength and beauty. And
do you know of the magazine Dezeen? That's how I pronounce it, Dezeen. It is a design and architecture magazine. That's my favorite. That's where I get my fun, looking at some really creative concepts that people about biophilic city design, about urban design, about public spaces. It's really something. You might like that one.
I think I would.
Thank you, Anna, for your time this morning.
Yeah, it's really nice. Thanks for appreciating my work.
To learn more about Anna's projects and to find out where you can see Anna's work in person, visit the show notes for this episode at talaterra.com. Talaterra is a podcast for and about independent educators working in natural resource fields and environmental education. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with friends and colleagues. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is Tania Marien.